Agora a nossa palestra é com o professor Hicks. Ele é professor de filosofia na Rockford University, em Illinois. E Stephen é PhD pela Universidade de Indiana e autor dos livros Explaining Postmodernism, tá difícil aqui o nome, Skepticism and Socialism from Rousseau to Foucault, and Nietzsche and the Nazis. Então, por favor, professor Stephen.
Obrigado. Eu falo pouco de português, but I will be speaking in English. I'm a philosopher by training, and this is a conference essentially on liberalism. And so I want to start with a philosophical question about liberalism. And it will tie into this. As a philosopher, of course, we ask the question, what is that? Now this is, as we know, controversial. Everything in philosophy, everything in economics, everything in politics is controversial. And many of the controversies are philosophical in nature. And my view is we spend a lot of time arguing about politics, and then many times we go nowhere. And that's because most of the debates about politics really aren't about politics. Right? They're actually about philosophical issues. In many cases, those philosophical issues are implicit or buried in the discussion. So I want to take up this question, and what I want to do is give you 13 arguments or 13 answers that have been given to this question, because the case for liberalism, there are many virtues of liberalism that have been cited, that some people find convincing, and if we survey the history of great liberal thinkers, they emphasize different things. I think they all integrate ultimately into an overall argument for liberalism, and again, everything is controversial, but let's run through some of these important arguments. Well, what is liberalism? Essentially, it's a network of principles that have become institutionalized in a society. We're familiar with these if we take our courses in political economy, political science, and so forth. Societies are liberal to the extent that they embody these principles. Limitations on government, rule of law, separation of church and state, constitutional principles. People are free in all of the major areas of their lives, religiously, scientifically, economically, in terms of their family life, and so forth. And a principled commitment to those things makes a society liberal. But why is that a good way to organize society? Good, of course, is an ethics concept, and ethics takes us into philosophy. So I want to make those connections. First argument is that freedom itself is a moral good. So if you have a liberal society, that makes it alone by itself good, because it increases the amount of freedom that individuals have to make their own decisions about what their goals are, what their dreams are, in all areas of their lives. That human beings are by their nature not slaves, they are not servants, that to the extent that we make our own choices and take responsibility for the choices that we have made, the freedom that enables us to do that makes us better people. And so societies are good on that basis alone, to the extent that they respect this natural birthright of human freedom. And that's one powerful argument that's been given. But then we will say there are consequences of having freedom. To the extent that people are free, they are more likely to be motivated by what we call the profit motive generically. Now we can use the profit motive narrowly in a business context. If I am free to pursue my own business, and we know that in a liberal society I am going to keep the fruits of my labor, then I am more likely to work hard, and I will therefore be more productive. But also if I'm in a society where I am free to choose my career, what line of work that I am going to go into, instead of, as say, under feudalism, where your class membership determines what kind of work you can go into, or under centralized and socialized systems where the centralized government will assign people to industry sectors that are judged to be necessary according to the society as a whole. So to the extent then that people are free, they are incentivized to pursue their idea about what's going to make their life better, right, as individuals, and we can call that the profit motive. And so people then, if they are doing something that they are more likely to enjoy, and they know that they're going to keep the fruits of their labor, they're going to work harder. They'll be more incentivized. And as a result, liberal societies are going to be wealthier, right, societies, right, compared to other things. And then we have, of course, the value judgment, better to be wealthy than it is to be poor, right? And so then if liberal societies do this, that makes them better as well. But we can also say that under liberal societies, right, we have ways of people coming together. Millions of people, say, in a liberal society, they each know, right, what they know, right, differently, their particular needs, their particular wants, their particular circumstances. And this is the kind of argument, of course, that Hayek and Mises, right, will make, right, that liberal societies are more efficient, right, at using the knowledge available to individuals. That there is no such thing as a giant central brain, right, that knows everything. And even if you take the 12 or 20 most genius individuals, right, in any society and put them in charge of organizing the whole society, they know a lot less, right, than the millions and millions of people in a society, right, who know about local circumstances, their needs and wants, and so on. And so we have the explanations that through markets, and then more impersonal markets, supply and demand, financial markets, right, and so forth, all of the needs and wants of people in society are coordinated with price signals and so on. And so the argument then is that out of all of these trade networks, people start to trade with each other, they build up mutually beneficial relationships, and then you have a society that is wealthier. So people are incentivized to work harder, and we make better use of really the most important asset, right, that we have in society, and that is the knowledge, right, of smart people, right, in society. Also, though, liberal societies, right, are much more individualistic. If you say it's up to you to make your own choices, to go your own way in life, and you're free to experiment and do whatever you want, then of course people will make all kinds of different experiments. People have different values, different goals, different interests, run different experiments, right, and so on. And so you will have a culture that celebrates, right, and encourages people to be more individual. So you'll have more creative artists, more creative engineers, more creative scientists, right, and so forth, in all walks of life. But it's precisely out of that experimental creative individualism that you will get more innovation. By contrast, if you have a society where people are taught to follow orders, right, or a society in which it's encouraged to do what everybody else is doing, right, as alternative political systems do, those will be much less innovative, much more stagnant kind of culture. But by contrast, a society that encourages freedom is going to encourage individuality, and you are going to get a whole lot more innovation. And so as a result of all of that innovation, right, you will get more wealth. So people will work harder, they will work smarter, and they will be more creative. And then the point then is, it's precisely the freedom as the fundamental point in that society that explains why the relatively freer societies in the world, it's not a coincidence that they all happen to be much wealthier, right, as societies, right, in the world. Now, this is the focus so far just on the production side of things, but we can say we're not only interested in people being productive, but also we're interested in distribution, right? Who gets the goods, right, so to speak. And one standard argument is that to the extent that a society as a whole, right, becomes more prosperous, it affords opportunities, right, for everybody, right, to become, right, better off. There's more wealth available, there's more jobs available, there's more entrepreneurship that is encouraged, and so everybody in various ways, right, is better off. Or sometimes the argument is that it's the majority, right, that is better off. Or we might say it's the greatest happiness for the greatest number, as utilitarians sometimes will argue. That not everybody, of course, is going to be successful in a liberal society. Some people will make bad choices, some people will fail and become bankrupt. But by and large, you're going to get more people who are prosperous than in any other kind of society. Or we might say it's the common man, right, who is better off. That if you look at the standard of living of people who are not necessarily geniuses, but they're not at the low end of the spectrum either, that the standard of living for the middle class, the average people also rises, and you can look at the statistics there as well. All right, so that's a network of claims there, but we can also make the argument, and this is often made, right, that if you are really concerned with the fate of the poorest, right, members of society, that is precisely a liberal society that is most going to benefit them. Because one of the reasons why poor people in poor societies have been poor is that they have not been allowed, right, so to speak, to own property in their own name, or to go into certain lines of work, right, or if you're a woman, right, you cannot open a bank account, right, in your own name. And so other kinds of social institutions, right, necessarily then keep people poor. So if you, by contrast, right, give poor people lots of freedom and don't have all of these barriers, right, put in front of them, then their entrepreneurism, right, will increase, right, and they will start to become more active and they will lift themselves, right, out of poverty. Now, of course, it also means that there will be, in a liberal society, right, a whole lot more jobs, right, that are created, and for those people who are not particularly entrepreneurial, they will be better off and be able to lift themselves out of poverty by having a steady job, right, at an enterprise created by some entrepreneur. Closely related to that, right, is the idea then, if you are concerned with people who can't support themselves, right, then those people will be better off in a rich society, right, because in a rich society there's going to be more wealth available for charitable, right, philanthropic, right, purposes. And so the best long-range strategy then is to first create a society that is wealthy, so that people who create much more wealth than they need for themselves have extra that's going to be available for those who cannot, right, support themselves. We can also then go to the other end, so to speak, of the spectrum. We could say there are, of course, in any societies, people who are potentially great athletes, great musicians, right, great scientists, great poets, right, or whatever. And most of those enterprises are very wealth intensive. Right? If you were going to devote yourself to music, or you were going to devote yourself to becoming a great artist, right, or a great scientist, all of those things are going to take a lot of money, a lot of years of education, and in many cases lots of resources, right, that are available to you. For example, if we're going to have a symphony orchestra, right, we're going to take it on the road, well, you just calculate the amount of money. Right? Only rich societies are going to be able to support the great musicians, right, the great orchestras, the great artists, the great scientists, and of course the great athletes, right, who in many cases need lots of time for training, specialized diets, specialized medical care, right, and so forth. And so if we want a society, right, in which we maximize, right, the number of people who are going to do the awesome things that inspire us, right, then we need to have a rich society in the first place, and then the argument is, again, liberal societies are the ones that create, right, all of that wealth. Another kind of argument is to say that liberal societies are the ones that make people happier. Right? And so here there's partly a psychological claim about human nature that you cannot really be happy, right, unless you have your own ideas, right, about what matters to you, and you are able to pursue your own personal conception of the good life. If you're in a society where you're told what to do, right, and you are not able to express yourself, you have to dress the way other people tell you to dress, eat the food, right, do the jobs and so forth that are dictated to you in various ways, well, you might get some measures of satisfaction in your life, but you are not going to be as fulfilled, right, as people in a society, right, who in their bones, right, know that they can do what they want with their lives and take their lives in whatever direction they want, and that to the extent that they succeed, they know that they succeeded because of their choices and their efforts. That's where the deepest self-satisfaction in life comes from. So you will get more opportunities for happiness in a liberal society than in any other kind of society. Closely related kind of argument is that liberal societies, right, are more interesting. Right? If you go to of course, societies that are very hierarchical or very conformist, right, we think of, right, traditional feudal societies or tribal societies, right, or socialistic societies, there can be some interesting things there. But we're interested in lots of people doing lots of interesting things. If you think about, for example, why we go to parties. Well, we don't go to parties because we're just going to meet 20 people, all of whom have the same opinions, watch all of the same movies, right, have all traveled to exactly the same places. We go to parties, as an example, because we want to meet interesting people, and we want to meet people who are doing all sorts of different, right, interesting things. So a society, as a liberal society does, that encourages people to go off and be entrepreneurs and be adventurers and be dreamers and so forth, is going to have a lot more interesting people in it doing more interesting things, and that'll be a more enjoyable society to live in. Finally, not finally, but getting close to finally, there's an argument about liberalism and tolerance. If we think about the kinds of things that have set people at each other's throats and caused conflict, right, over the course of centuries, right? Take religion, right, as an example, right? The idea that religion should be uniform, that everybody has to believe the same religion, right? And so then anybody who deviates is seen as a threat. Or that religion should be a matter of state control, right? Whether to ban it or to promote, right, a particular religion, right? Then naturally, of course, people resist, right? And we have a great source of conflict because people's views on religion are, of course, very, right, important to them. But if we have a society that, as a matter of principle, right, that says individuals should think and decide for themselves on these most important issues, including religious issues, then you are more likely to have a society that will be willing to tolerate other people having differences of opinion. That if we disagree on religion, of course I will argue with you, I might not like you very much, and the same thing will happen with respect to you coming back to me, but we will take away that natural thing that all human beings in all societies prior to liberal societies have done, and that is to sort differences of religion out by violence and impositional, right, types of methods. So you'll have a more peaceful and tolerant society, that the argument is. Sexism and racism, right, two other, right, social ills that have plagued human beings forever, right? Precisely because liberal societies prize freedom. Right? They say freedom doesn't know color. Freedom does not know sex and gender differences. Women are fully human beings. People of other races are fully human beings. When we have to respect their individuality as human beings and their freedom to pursue their own lives. And so it's only been, right, in the last few hundred years, for the first time in human history, where there was the beginnings of the development of liberal societies, right, in England, in Western Europe, and in the Americas, that slavery was challenged, right, on moral grounds, and the battle was joined against slavery and racism, and those went on the defensive. And the same thing holds with respect to sexism. It's only been in the liberal societies in the last few centuries, right, that the freedom rights of women have been respected, and we have made some progress in those areas. And we can obviously just make a connection here on strictly economic grounds, right, to the extent that, I would make a connection, say, to the profit motive. Suppose I'm in business and I want to make a lot of money, right, and I'm hiring, and I've got two candidates, right, one is a man and one is a woman, right, maybe I'm a sexist, right, maybe I don't want to work with women, right, and so forth. But suppose, right, the woman who was applying was an excellent student, right, in university and got all A grades or the best grades, right, and the young man who was also applying, a recent university graduate, was just an average student, right, and so forth. Well, whom will I hire? Well, to the extent that I'm a sexist, right, I'm going to say, well, I don't want to hire the woman, I only want to hire the man because I only want to work with men. But to the extent that I am a profit-seeking capitalist, right, I'm going to say the woman is the superior candidate. She is the one who's smarter, she's the one who works harder, she's the one who's more likely to make money for me in my business. So the liberal free market profit motive then is going to incentivize people to overlook their sexism, to overlook their racism, and be more likely to work peacefully with people of different sexes and different races. Finally, right, we will have a less war-like society. And of course you can look at the historical data, right, take the societies that have been, in the last 2 centuries, the most liberal. and then count how many times they've gone to war with each other. The number is almost close to 0. And the battles that have occurred among the more liberal societies have been typically shorter-lived and fewer lives lost. And the argument makes sense, right? If you are in liberal societies, right, you want to make a lot of money, you want to trade with as many people as you can, so you want to trade with people in other countries, and so we start to have more globalism, right, that goes on. But what that means, though, is that your vendors, right, are in other countries. Right? They're sending you, say, all of the raw materials that your business needs and so forth. Well, you don't want to go to war with that country, because if you go to war with that country, right, then you're not going to be able to buy from your vendor anymore. That's going to destroy your business. Right? At the same time, if you're selling, right, millions of dollars of goods to another country, right, over here, right, well, you don't want to go to war with that country either, because that means then you're not going to be able to sell millions of dollars of goods and so forth. So it's going to incentivize then people to want peaceful international relations, right, to the extent that they are profit-seeking capitalists, right, in a free market and so on. Okay, now that is, to my mind, nothing original, right, in that. That is just my summarizing of the major arguments that are made on behalf of liberalism, right, by some of the great geniuses, right. So, for example, the one about individual freedom, that's the one that Ayn Rand, right, really pushes hard on, right, as a fundamental principle. The important point about incentives and the profit motive, Milton Friedman, right, does brilliant, right, work talking about incentivizations. The issues about dispersed knowledge and win-win trade networks, Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, right, are most famous, and Hayek won the Nobel Prize for largely showing how that works out. The point about individuality, creativity, and innovation, that's the point that Joseph Schumpeter, right, which his thesis about creative destruction, right, is most affiliated with, right, and so on. And so this is a matter of drawing on the arguments that the great liberal thinkers of the last couple of centuries have made and just kind of putting them together into a hopefully prettier kind of flowchart here. Now, what does any of this have to do with philosophy? Now we're going to get to the next point of my talk. Well, all of those arguments I gave you, of course, are controversial, and one of the reasons why it's both fun and frustrating, right, to do all of this is you start arguing about one, and there's counter-arguments, but then you're led to the other one, and then you have your 5-beer, 6-hour conversation, right, that we all enjoy having on the weekends, right, and so forth. And so the question is, are those claims true, right? So is the logic and the data and the history, right, in support of the kinds of arguments that liberals have traditionally made? And there are powerful arguments, right, against them, right, that are mounted by people from various philosophical perspectives, right, strong conservatives, strong egalitarians, strong tribalists, strong communitarians, right, and so forth. And we do need to engage, of course, all of those arguments. But I want to now narrowly, right, more focus. To the extent that those arguments have been very powerful for centuries and convinced lots of very smart people, there is a puzzle, right, for this venue, right, in particular, because those arguments do not get very wide play, right, in Latin America. And to the extent that they are enunciated and made in Latin America, they typically have very little impact. And the question is, why is that? Right? And I want to make the claim that philosophy has a lot, perhaps the majority, right, to do with trying to explain what that is. But I want to turn to it. That's going to be my answer to the question. Special pleading, right, as a philosopher. Give me 20 minutes and I'll see if I can convince you. All right, let's look at some numbers. Okay. This is time along the bottom, just the last 2,000 years. So, lifespan of Jesus here, Roman Republic is declining, it's being replaced by, right, the Roman Imperium. Right? So it's stopping to be a republic and starting to become a traditional hierarchical monarchy. 500 years later, Rome has declined. We're into the Dark Ages for 500 years. Right? There's the plague. 500 years later, right, Columbus is crossing the ocean, and then we get in the recent 500 years. On the vertical axis is world population. And it goes up here to about 6 billion. Now what's interesting is to start looking at these green dots with a dollar number. Right? This is the social scientist's best calculation of GDP, which of course is a crude measure, right, of productivity around the world, right, at a given time. And what this then tells us, do I have a clicker on this thing here? There we are. Year zero, there's about 200 million people able to live in the whole world, and average income is $467 per person per year. And of course, you can only live on, right, what you produce, so that means people are living on about 467 US dollars per year. Now this is only 2,000 years. If you were to go back another 2,000 years, that line is pretty much flat. Another 2,000 years, another 2,000 years, 2,000 years. You go back about 16 to 18,000 years, so we're somewhere around here on this chart. Right? Flat line. Now, before that, it goes down lower, right? Because that's about where the agricultural revolution occurred. Domestication of animals, which is much more productive agriculturally than just hunting. Domestication of crops, so planting is much more productive. Prior to that, the best estimates are that it's in the $200 per year range. So this is pretty good. But let's only focus on the last 200 years, right? So 467, we go 1,000 years. I try to imagine how long 1,000 years is. Yeah, I can't wrap my mind around it. But notice, essentially, that's a flat line. Right? No change for 1,000 years. Right? Slight decline. Right? So then we jump another 500 years, and we're at 566, and the population has increased slightly. That's still very low, but that's about a 20% increase, and that's significant, right, in context. So things are starting to happen. Then we jump another, say, 250 years, and it's gone up again. And then notice what has happened in the last 250 years. That line essentially goes vertical. And that's where we pay attention. Because from there's what I want, here to there. In 200 years, that is an increase tenfold. Never happened before in human history anywhere. A blink of an eye historically, and somehow human beings have figured out how to make themselves 10 times as productive, right, on average. Why did that happen? I would say if you're a young person, or if you are planning to be an intellectual, or you are an intellectual, this is, in my estimation, one of the two most important questions to think about and figure out the answer why that happened. Now we also know, however, though, that $6,000 right per year in most countries, many countries rather of the world, if you're earning $6,000 a year, you are considered poor. I'm a native of Canada. Right? That's below the poverty line for Canada. It's below the poverty line for the United States. Right? We go to countries, most of us, where the average income now is $6,000 a year, and it is scary to us how awful and primitive the living conditions are of people living at $6,000 a year. And then it becomes mind-boggling to think that those people are 10 times as rich, right, as people 250 years ago, and I don't know what would the math be, about 30 times as rich, right, as people living over here. But I want to notice that this is a world average, and so obviously some countries are below, some countries. Bolivia, right, poorest country to my knowledge, right, in the Americas, right, and that's the numbers from 2014.
Yeah, Venezuela is competing for the first.
Yes. Right, these numbers change year to year, absolutely. Okay. Guatemala, 20% better. Paraguay, maybe 30% better. Another group of countries in the 6,000 to 7,000 range. But notice already that those four countries in red are about twice as wealthy on average as the first pair. Another trio, here we are, Brazil. And the average Brazilian is about 3 to 4 times as rich as the average Bolivian. Another two countries, Uruguay, Chile, another 25% increase over Brazil, Argentina, and so on. All right, now, I'm going to go to my home and native land, Canada, next. 50,000. Okay. And then my current homeland, United States, at 54. And these numbers are a little bit higher right now. But the point is, okay, that when we talk about distribution of income, those numbers do tell us something. What this means is that the most successful of the Latin American nations are about 1/4 or so as wealthy as the two North American nations. Why is that? And we can't say it's natural resources, because there's awesome natural resources in North America and at least as awesome natural resources in all of the Latin American nations. It's not human capital, because both of them are relatively new countries, all of them, right, in the last couple of hundred years, developed largely by immigrants from many countries, right, from around the world. But what we do have is a very persistent pattern of the North American nations doing very, very well, and increasingly so, and the Latin American nations, some of them doing better, most of them struggling, and as we know, some in decline. Right? Why is that? All right. The topic of our conference is liberalism. One dimension of liberalism is economic. Social science in the last generation, especially with computer power, has done awesome work, right, calculating all sorts of things. So one thing we can do is study all of the countries, and there are teams in all of the countries, asking about their economic freedom. How easy is it for you to start a business? If you have a contract dispute with another business, how easy is it for you to have access to the judicial system to reach a by and large fair verdict? Right? Can women open a bank account, right, in their own name? Right? Can they sign contracts, right, in their own name? If you want to hire someone from another country to come and work for your business, is it easy to do so or difficult to do so? If you want to produce goods and sell them, right, across some border or other, is that easy for you to do or difficult? And so there are 20 or 30 dimensions that we can measure economic freedom on, and then tabulate the results. And we get fairly consistent results, right, over the course of the last several decades. Here are the top 5 countries in the world: Hong Kong, Singapore, New Zealand, Switzerland, and Australia. Then we go up to the top 20, right, and so on. We have all of these nations as well. So I've highlighted Canada, right, and the United States. Formerly, right, they were higher. They've declined just a little bit, right, recently. But where are the Latin nations? So here's Brazil, 122nd. It's in the bottom half. Right, you know this, right, especially if you are in business. It's very hard to do business, right, in Brazil or anywhere in Latin America. And then here we sample some more: Ecuador, Bolivia, Argentina, Venezuela, Cuba, and so forth. And this index measures about 180. So the data is good, but you can correlate the nations that are prosperous and the nations that have economic freedom, and it's almost a one-to-one coordination. Countries that have a lot of economic freedom, they're all rich. Countries that have very little economic freedom, they're all poor. Countries that have mixtures are mixed, right, in terms of their wealth. So that's not just abstract philosophical argumentation, that's what the empirical data shows. And that's worth paying attention to. Top 2 Latin American nations, right? Chile has liberalized a lot, right, recently, and shot up, right, in the rankings, and that's why it's very high. Uruguay also consistently, right, pretty good. Corruption, right? What can I say to Brazilians, right, about corruption that you don't know? Well, I won't say very much, right? But another correlation is we get closer to ethics and political morality, right, and so forth, closer to the terrain of philosophy. Red is bad, right? Not red is better, right? And once again, you can see, right, the nations that are the least corrupt are the richest. Right? The Northern Europeans, the Northwestern Europeans, the North Americans, Chile and Uruguay doing better. Right? Botswana, if you're interested, the one sub-Saharan nation that's actually improving a lot over the last generation, Australia, New Zealand, right, and so on. And of course, the degree of corruption is tied to the degree of political influence in the economy, right? Increase the size of your government, you increase the size, scope of opportunities for all kinds of corruption, and you get, right, the worst results. Here are the measures, the top 10 least corrupt, right, nations in the world. Now we get to the middle of the pack. And there's Brazil, again, right in the bottom half. Probably that's going to be declining, right, in the last year or two. Now I want to make a strong claim here, right, that there's no excuse for this. Particularly in Brazil, with awesome human capital, awesome natural resources, Brazil should be an extremely rich, prosperous nation. And it's not through ignorance that we don't know anymore how to create societies that are not corrupt and not are able to produce lots of wealth. The data is good, the arguments, right, are there. So there's something else that's going on. Usual suspects is to blame bad politicians, and I'm all in favor of blaming bad politicians, right? Go for it, right? They are a lot of times bad people, right? In many cases, of course, politicians will say, well, you know, in order to get power, in order to get anything done, you have to compromise and do various things and so forth. Technical philosophical language, that is bullshit, right? Right? There are lots of examples of people being able to effect positive political change without compromising their integrity. Right? So you make a choice to accept that bribe, right, to vote for policies that you don't agree with, to pander in various ways. You are making a choice. Right? Right? So you can blame those people and so forth. Crony businesses, right, who get into bed with government, who seek special favors, who want to pass regulations, right, against their competitors and so forth. That also is a choice, because there are lots of examples of successful businesses making wealth honestly by producing good stuff. If you choose to get in bed with the government and you choose not to emulate those other ones, that is a choice. And you can be blamed for that. But I want to say, those are not the worst of the people, and those are not the source of the big problem. The problem is the intellectuals. That is, in my estimation, the deepest, it's my profession, so to speak, the philosophers, right, who are the most to blame. So I want to tell you a quick story, especially for students, right, who are in the midst of their education. And the claim I'm going to make is the chances are very good that even if you are a thoughtful, well-read person, you are only getting a half education in Latin America, and this is your biggest problem. Here are the 6 richest nations in the world. We'll come at it this way. 5 of them have something in common, right? What is that? Test your knowledge of geography and history. Something to do with the English. What is that?
Colonization.
Colonization. 5 of the 6 are former British colonies. Okay? Switzerland is the outlier. If you take the top 20 most free nations in the world, 70% of them are former British colonies. The number of economically free nations in the world that are former Portuguese colonies is 0. Former Spanish colonies, 0. Former French colonies, former German colonies, 0. So whatever we think about colonization, right, of course there's a mixed story, right, should be told here, but whatever the British did, some good things, right, and some bad things, has had results that are influential. Right? And I want to say it's not just British culture, but also British philosophy that stands behind that culture, right, as well. So the British Empire, the argument making is, right, had a certain culture, something to do with economics, politics, how we do our family life, what we think about religion, and so forth. And the British Empire spread that around the world and institutionalized it through various official institutions, education, politics, rule of law, and so forth. But what does this mean? Right? And on the right here, I've got the names of people whose names you probably have heard of. But in Latin America, you do not get a good solid education, right, in who those people are. By contrast, in North America, you do, if you are a well-trained humanities or social science, right, intellectual. And the idea is that about 200 to 300 years ago, perhaps a little bit earlier, right, the best philosophers and intellectuals in the world were British. They were the ones who had the most original, the most powerful arguments, and they, by and large, prevailed, right, and clustered their views around a set of principles that I've got over here. The idea that government should have limitations on it, right? That government can and should do certain things, but it should not be unlimited, right, in its scope. That we need to separate church and state, right, as a matter of principle, right? Religion should be a private matter. We have to stop this horrible history, right, of politicians using religion for political reasons and religious people being able to use politics for religious reasons. It's a private, individual matter. That people should be free to go into whatever line of work they want, not based on their class membership. A little bit later, not based on their gender. A little bit later, not based on their race, right, either. People should do whatever they want, trade with whomever they want, sell to whomever they want, and so forth. The idea that people should strive for happiness, right? That we are not servants of the king, right? We are not servants of our feudal lord, right? We're not slaves, we are not peasants or whatever, that every human being has a natural birthright to be able to pursue happiness. That we should celebrate people being individuals, right? Cultivating their own tastes, their own musical preferences, their own lifestyles, and so on. That people can think for themselves, right? And we can trust people to run their own lives, right? In a relatively free society, because people can be smart, and anybody with basic education and application can develop the knowledge and the good judgment to be able to run their own lives. We don't need authorities to tell us how to live our lives. And then this idea of empiricism, that we put it to the test. It's not just abstract theory, that we are willing to change our minds if the evidence goes against us, and so on. Now, this is a cartoon thumbnail, right, of a multi-dimensional set of arguments, but this came to prevail in Britain, the English Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment. Of course, all of these were controversial there, but it came to be the dominant set of beliefs in British culture. It was exported to North America and to various other places around the world, where most of these names were household names, and everybody would have a copy of John Locke on their bookshelf, right, even if they were a farmer, and so on. Now, by contrast, if you go across the English Channel, right, to the continent, a very different philosophical tradition, right, came into existence 2 to 3 centuries ago that on most issues disagreed fundamentally, right, with the philosophical answers that the British intellectuals, right, were coming up with. And if you were a well-trained intellectual, right, in Europe, and the argument I'm going to make is that Latin American intellectuals see these people as their gurus, the one to whom they take their leading light, right, you get a very different philosophical tradition. Thank you. Now, I don't know how many of you, right, have read these people, so let me just again give you a cartoon, right, thumbnail sketch of what you get from each of these, right, people, and the contrast will be to these principles that are being taught in the Anglo and American tradition. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right, hated individualism. Right, he argued that people are almost organically, right, part of a community, and that you need to surrender your individual to the common good, but that, of course, the common good has to be manifested in the political leaders, right, who are the spokesmen, right, for the common good, and when the common good has spoken, your obligation as an individual is to do what is good for the community. Religion, right, he thought was a state matter, not an individual matter, that religion should be mandated, and that anybody who dissented from the officially recognized state religion should be killed. All theater should be shut down on grounds of immorality, and all press, newspapers, publication of books should be censored by the state on the grounds of what is good for the community as a whole. Kant, controversial one here. argued that reason is fundamentally flawed and limited and unable to know reality as it really is, that we are all trapped in subjective categorizations, right, that are pre-filters of all experience. So we cannot know through the application of reason or the use of our senses the way the world actually is. In his ethics, he was a strict advocate of a duty-based ethics. Ethics and being a good person is not about your dreams, your pursuit of happiness, your inclinations. Instead, there are ironclad, firm principles of morality that one must follow no matter what. And that the purest test, actually, of your being a moral person are the cases where what you want to do, what's going to make you happy, is in conflict with what your moral duty says, and you sacrifice your happiness for the sake of doing your duty. That's what we should all strive for. Hegel, of course, advocate of an absolute state, right? That we should worship the state the way intensely religious people worship their gods. And the reason for that is he thought was intimately connected, that the working out of the state is in fact the working out of the plan of God in reality. And so if you are challenging the state, you are at the same time challenging God. And what do we do with people who challenge God? Right? We know the history here. And that the state, so to speak, is above morality, right? And that history is by and large driven by great men who are embodiments of God's divine purpose right on earth, and they have the moral sanction to do what is ever necessary to take society to its next evolutionary stage. Karl Marx, I'm sure you've heard of this guy, right, saw people as fundamentally divided into classes, right? In fundamental conflict with each other. The rich hate the poor, and the poor hate the rich. But that people's intellects and their beliefs and their value systems are conditioned by their economic circumstances. So it's impossible for any people of different classes to rationally compromise and reach agreement and so forth. And so necessarily the only way we can make social progress is by rising up in a violent revolution and killing all of the bad people and establishing a dictatorship, right? Temporarily. Freud argues that people are fundamentally irrational, driven by centuries of instinct, right, bred into them, and that human beings survive because they are top predators, and so we are aggressive. And what we like more than anything else is to see other people humiliated, to be able to dominate them. If we can kill them and steal from them and get away with it, that's what our deepest, darkest self, right, is all about. And then, of course, we also have the sex drive, right, which manifests itself. And when our sex drive heats up, of course, our mind shuts down. We are creatures of instinct, not creatures of reason. And that the best test of this is how much we all love war, even though we pretend that we don't. Freud argues that in his context, World War I, for example, when all of the allegedly civilized nations of the world just threw everything up in the air, started killing each other to the tunes of millions, so to speak, to get all of this pent-up instinctual energy out of them. But that's the human condition. Conflict, right, and so on. Heidegger, very deep philosopher. Thank you. Also happened to be, you might know this, Nazi. Right? Not just a Nazi, a gung-ho Nazi, right? Praised Hitler, right, in his speeches, and explicitly saw his philosophical system as developed for the purpose of supporting a generic kind of national socialism. Despite the Holocaust, and he lived on until the 1970s, never apologized, never repented, right, for his political views, and continued to believe that some kind of national socialism is the best aspiration, right, for humanity. Sartre, right, existentialist, right, philosopher, arguing that human life is ultimately absurd, right, that we are pushed around by irrational emotions, and that the best that we can do is to make, right, an ungrounded commitment to something or other and try to create some sort of meaning in these ultimately arbitrary, right, commitments, and then we die. Also, right, a communist, right, sympathizer in his politics. Hated the United States, right, admired the Soviet and Chinese communist experiments. Foucault and Derrida, the two leading postmodern, right, intellectuals, right, both extraordinarily far left, right, in their politics, all of them opponents of the idea that through reason and argumentation we can figure out the truth about the world. Instead, a deeply skeptical, relativized, and communalized approach. Now, the point I'm going to make is that there are differences, right, among all of these philosophers, but when you step back, right, in the continental philosophical tradition, you work this territory, and that's what it is to be an intellectually educated person, and you do not, by and large, study the philosophers in the Anglo-American tradition. And the connection to Latin America is that Latin American intellectuals draw their primary inspiration still to this day from thinkers in the continental tradition. I speak to them, I read them, and they don't know much about John Stuart Mill. Of course, they've heard of him, or John Locke, or Adam Smith, right, and so on. But they do know all of these people, right, very well. They are intelligent, they are deep thinkers, but they have half an education. And the problem is that for generation after generation, right, professors have been teaching the next generation of students to think inside this philosophical box. Now, the point for this generation of students, and here I have a picture. 2 days ago, I saw something similar to this in Sao Paulo. Right? I went into a bookstore, the philosophy section, I always go there. All continental philosophers, no Anglo-American philosophers. This is actually from a bookstore in Buenos Aires, right, a year and a half ago. All, I don't know if you can read those titles, all continental philosophers, not a single Anglo-American philosopher represented. So, we work in a philosophical context. Philosophy gives us our broadest framework, right, within which we think about the meaning of life, what our goals are going to be, how we're going to organize our society. The modern world, philosophically, has been divided between the Anglo-Americans and the Continentals. Right? This is a very deep debate that is centuries, right, old. And I want to make the argument that the Latin American nations, right, part of the problem, a major part of their problem, is that they have adopted a philosophical system that is hostile, right, obviously, to entrepreneurism, hostile to individualism, hostile in many respects to the scientific method, right, hostile, right, to any sort of liberal society, and in many cases on freedom with respect to religion and so forth. And you don't find that in the Anglo-American cultures, and that's in large part why they are much more prosperous, right, at least in the economic sphere. So what I would say is, because most of you are students, is, I'll cite an English philosopher here, right, of course, set yourself the goal, whatever your major is. Don't become a philosopher necessarily, but you have to become philosophical. Right? You have to make philosophy a part of your education. And I can almost guarantee, right, the education that you are getting from your teachers, right, and professors is half an education. Everything is controversial, everything is difficult, and you will have to go out of your way on whatever issue, right, you are dealing with to look at the arguments, of course, that your professors are given to you. And they will be good arguments. They will be well thought out arguments. But make sure that you know there is an argument or two on the other side and seek those out. Right? Right, before you consider yourself, right, an educated person, make sure you have sampled both the continental tradition and you know, right, those names, and you have sampled also the Anglo-American tradition. How we learn, in many cases, the best, right, on complicated issues is by reading the smartest people on both sides of the debate. To get ourselves up to speed, right, in the debate. When we've done our homework, then we are ready, and not until then, to make up our own minds to enter into the debate and come down on one side of the debate or other. I want to close, because I've been speaking somewhat abstractly, right, and historically, right, by concretizing this. I'll just do a little survey here. Sometimes we think about the meaning of life when we are young in terms of role models and people we look up to, right, as heroes. So my question would be, if you think in Latin America, what one individual, the name of one individual who is most likely to be seen as the inspirational role model of what it is to be the best kind of person. Person you're most likely to see on t-shirts, person you're most likely to see if you go into university dorm rooms, on posters. Who would that be? Che Guevara, of course, everybody knows, right? Che Guevara, absolutely. He's everywhere. Okay. Right. But what does that mean? That we have a culture, right, in which young people are exposed to Che and what he stands for, and they pick up, even if they're not particularly intellectual. Right? Che actually read a lot. All those continental philosophers, he knew them well. He was a smart guy. He didn't know the English guys at all. He hadn't been exposed to them. But Che is a great man, right, of a certain sort. He stands for a certain philosophy of life, a certain meaningful approach to life about what it is to be the most vital, committed kind of person working toward the best causes that you possibly can. Right? So he embodies an approach to life. And essentially it's the continental, right, approach. Now by contrast, in North America, we have people who know about Che, everybody's heard about Che, and we have a small number of people who will wear Che t-shirts and have the posters right in their room. But if you survey North American kids in their teens and early 20s for the last generation about who the number one role model is, who I want to be most like, who do you think that would be? Think Silicon Valley, think Steve Jobs, I'm starting to hear, and that's exactly right. And that's exactly what the surveys, right, show. And again, Steve Jobs stands for a certain ideal, right, about what it is to live the best kind of life. And when young people say, I want to be like Steve Jobs, they don't necessarily mean they want to move to Silicon Valley and become computer developers, right, and so forth. Instead, it's the idea of being an entrepreneur, of being really passionately, right, committed to something, creating an awesome business, loving, right, what I do, adding enormous value to the world, becoming spectacularly rich, right, and so on. So it is another ideal that's enormously exciting and energizing, right, to young people. But it's very different from the ideal of being Che. And Steve Jobs, right, with that commitment to entrepreneurial freedom and that rational understanding that engineers and computer people have about the world, and that trial and error experimentalism about making things better and better, and the idea that we can peacefully trade with each other for mutual benefit and create an awesomely beautiful society in which everyone is prosperous. That's very different from the idea that we are divided along various dimensions that put us in conflict with each other, and I hate the system, and I hate at least half of the world's population, and we have to kill a huge number of them through violent revolutions before we can even talk about possibly creating something else. And chances are good that I am going to die as a relatively young person fighting this glorious battle as a failure, but how romantic is that? I chose these pictures carefully, as you can see. Because both of them, when these pictures were taken, right, were young men, right, full of energy, vitality, both intelligent. And that both as young men were making choices, very deep choices, about what kind of a, I don't know what your tastes are, but they're both handsome. And you can see, right, that light of life in their eyes. Right? And so the most important thing, right, is the choices, right, that we make, right, when we are young about what the meaning of our life is going to be. That is a deeply, right, philosophical, right, question. And my recommendation, right, in closing for the students especially here is, when you are making that choice, right, make sure you're making it in an informed way. Go out of your way to whatever extent is necessary to make sure that you're aware in an informed way of the options. And then, of course, make your passionate commitment. Right? I'll stop there. Did I leave any time for questions?
Not actually.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your time. Are you going to stay here for a while?
I am around, yes.
Ok, so... Quer dizer, agora eu tô com português, calma. O Stefan vai continuar aqui, tá? Então quem quiser fazer perguntas, eu não posso tirar do intervalo, então quem quiser fazer perguntas para ele estará aqui presente, então podem questionar ele bastante, ele adora receber perguntas, né? You love receiving questions.
I was going to say yes. Please feel welcome, students especially, if you have questions about philosophy, email me. Right? This is what I love to do, is talk about philosophy with people, so feel welcome.
Tá, então o Gabriel deu uma ideia bem interessante, vamos fazer um pouquinho diferente então. Quem quiser ficar aqui durante o seu intervalo fazendo perguntas para o Stephen, está liberado. Se alguém quiser sair para descansar um pouco, ou sei lá, mas o nosso descanso é liberalismo. Então, perguntas vão ser assim, eu vou passar com o microfone, tá? Podem fazer a pergunta em português ou em inglês, tá? Eu vou deixar um equipamento com o Stephen, se vocês fizerem em português, o tradutor vai traduzir pro inglês, tá? Só alguns pequenos detalhes, tá? Hoje os intervalos são um pouco mais longos, de 30 minutos, tá? Justamente porque quanto mais tempo dura o evento, é bom que vocês tenham tempos maiores de descanso. Os bares aqui provavelmente estão fechados no geral, então eu recomendo que vocês façam um coffee aqui dentro mesmo. E o livro Anatomia do Estado do Instituto Mises já esgotou, tá? Caso alguém não tenha pego, vocês podem ir lá no stand do IMB falar com o Fabrício, que está aqui. Está lá. E ele vai anotar o nome e e-mail de vocês, e quando chegar os livros, vai chegar até o final do evento, ele vai entregar para vocês pessoalmente. Então, levantem a mão, quem quiser fazer pergunta, e vamos fazer as perguntas. Tá, Fernanda, tem mais? Tá, vamos começar com a Fernanda, depois o pessoal libera. Português ou inglês, só pra... Tá, eu vou deixar o equipamento...
Ok.
I have a very quick question. In your opinion, the liberal societies, they are prepared to deal with ISIS terrorism? Because we have the liberal countries like North, we CICOC, and it's a very scary issue. I use Brussels like an example. They weren't prepared for ISIS terrorism.
Right, sure. So the question is, how should liberal societies deal with ISIS terrorism? Well, my view is, in general, we should have open borders, ideas, exchanging, goods exchanging, people moving. That should be the proper policy. I do also think that we know that there are going to be world crises that are going to occur, and there is a role ahead of time for governments and nonprofit organizations like the Red Cross and the United Way in the United States, and so forth, to have contingency plans for refugees, from those kinds of countries. And I think that is the way you have to handle it, It's a short-term emergency situation, and you have to have contingency plans in place for that. So the fact that they did not have that, I think, is a culpability. That's exactly why they exist, and so forth. But if in the future, we are wanting to be able to deal with refugees from conflict places, and they're going to continue to be so, our best chance of having successful resolutions of those problems is going to be having nations that are rich, that have the resources available to deal with those problems, that have enough creative thinkers to be able to think flexibly about the particular circumstances, and that have the engineering and logistical knowledge to be able to deal with these kinds of problems. That you have to have the wealth, the creativity, and the logistics to be able to deal with these problems. And it is going to be liberal societies that will have the best chance of developing those three things to solve the problem. So I would just say in this case, obviously it's a disaster. So what we should do is say it was a failed experiment. But as liberal, rational people, what can we learn from the experiment so that the next time it occurs, we know how to handle it better? Best I can do.
Here.
Thanks for the very compelling argument.
Thank you.
Well, yes. So lots of the top freer countries are from this Anglo-American tradition.
Yes.
But what happened with the countries that were also colonized by the British Empire, like many in Africa, and they didn't take this path? What happened there, and what can we learn from them that
Very good question.
to revert this in Brazil?
Yeah. Well, I don't know that the analogy holds right for Brazil, but you're exactly right that not all former British colonies, right, have been successful, right? And so the general point is, if we're interested in scientific method, social science, we should equally study those and see what the problems were. Absolutely. And I think there are lots of different explanations right there. In some cases, the British presence was lighter. In some cases, the particular British administration was run by people who were more autocratic, right? And so they actually functioned more like the Spaniards and the Portuguese and the French did, right, and so forth. So the British colonization was not the same, right, in all of these countries and so on. In some cases, I would say India is more of a failure case, right, because it was a former British colony. But there what you had was a culture that had thousands of years, right, of cultural traditions. And the British presence was strong, right, and powerful, but it was still relatively a superficial, right, add-on set of institutions. So when the British left, the Indians, by and large, reverted to their older ways. And I don't think there is one answer to each of the failure cases, but your point is exactly right that we should look at them. Now, in the case of Brazil, I don't know what Brazil, right, can learn from it, because obviously the solution for Brazil is not going to be, okay, let's invite the British to come in here and take over for 20 years, and we'll just do whatever they say, right? Right, that's not going to happen, and that would be actually insulting, right, to Brazilians to think that somebody has to come in and tell them what to do. So I would say the lesson for Brazilians would be that we can learn, right, as open-minded, right, thoughtful people to what works in other countries and what has failed in other countries. And the Brazilians can make their own judgment about what has worked and adapt, right, those institutions, adapt those, right, technologies. The same way people learn from each other with respect to technology, right? You just see what other people are doing. Some technologies, you try them out, they don't work, you throw them away. These ones seem to be working. You learn from other people, you try them out, and you adapt them to your particular circumstance, right, and so on.
Eu peço desculpas ao professor Stefan, mas infelizmente nós vamos ter que cortar as perguntas agora, tá? Mas vocês podem continuar perguntando para ele agora no intervalo, tá? A gente só vai ter que realmente abrir o intervalo, tá? Qualquer dúvida ele vai estar aqui, pode perguntar para ele. Então, novamente, uma salva de palmas para o